I used to think love meant patience, until my future mother-in-law slid a prenup across the table, calling me a gold digger in front of 80 elite guests. She thought she was protecting her family's hollow wealth, but the only thing I was digging was a grave for her fake empire. Have you ever seen a dynasty crumble from one black folder? Listen closely. Tonight, their honor will be ground to dust. Hello, wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for your continuous and heartfelt support over the years. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the necessary budget to operate, which means we are forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and will be shifting our focus entirely to Patreon. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon family, where you will gain access to exclusive, true stories that are even better, significantly longer, and packed with intricate details we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors in a single narrative. You can easily join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code displayed on your screen, or by clicking the direct link provided in the description and pinned comment below this video. Now, let us dive into the events of that fateful night. And my name is Lucia Hudson. I was 29 years old when I found myself sitting in the grand, suffocating banquet hall of the Sapphire Point Manor, a sprawling coastal estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the overwhelming scent of imported white orchids and the cloying, expensive perfumes of 80 of America's most elite, old money aristocrats. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a harsh, glittering light over tables draped in imported silk linens and lined with solid silver cutlery. Every single detail in the room screamed of centuries-old wealth and untouchable privilege. I sat perfectly still, feeling entirely swallowed whole by the extravagance, an outsider marooned on an island of unimaginable, generational arrogance. The ocean breeze outside battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the air was entirely stagnant, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to draw a full breath. Right beside me sat my fiancé, Julian Vance. To anyone else in the room, Julian was the picture-perfect heir. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo that hugged his broad shoulders, his hair styled flawlessly, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He possessed the kind of effortless, aristocratic grace that only comes from centuries of breeding and inherited privilege. But I knew the tragic truth beneath that polished exterior. Behind the dazzling smile and the charming anecdotes he shared with the hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons seated around us, Julian was a profound coward. He was a man who had never fought a single battle in his entire life, completely submissive, forever bowing his head to the iron will of his family. He was terrified of losing his inheritance, terrified of being cut out of the high society circles, and most of all, terrified of his own mother. That iron will was currently circling our table in the form of his mother, Eleanor, and his younger sister, Beatrice. They moved through the banquet hall like two apex predators in designer gowns, their eyes constantly darting toward me with thinly veiled disdain. Every time they passed our table, they made sure to drop a perfectly weaponized compliment to remind me of my place. "Lucia, darling, you look so wonderfully quaint tonight," Eleanor purred, stopping behind my chair and placing a cold, heavily jeweled hand on my bare shoulder. "That silk dress is so modest. It is quite refreshing to see someone brave enough to wear something completely unbranded to an event like this. It really shows your humble roots." Beatrice snickered from a few feet away, swirling her expensive champagne. "Oh, Mother, leave her alone. Not everyone can afford Parisian couture on a basic data entry salary. I think it is sweet that she tries so hard to blend in with us." My hands gripped the linen napkin in my lap until my knuckles turned white. They were thoroughly convinced that I was just a lowly data analyst, scraping by on a pathetic, hand-to-mouth salary at Cipherloom Industries. To the Vance family, who made their supposed fortunes in tangible assets like commercial real estate and international shipping, Cipherloom was just some obscure, provincial tech startup. They thought it was a nameless, Unimpressive little company barely worth their breath to even mock properly. They thought I spent my days hunched over a cubicle desk, typing numbers into a spreadsheet just to afford my rent. In their eyes, I was a desperate commoner, clawing my way up the social ladder to secure a piece of their historic, golden empire. I kept my chin leveled and maintained a quiet, humble demeanor. I forced myself to swallow every barbed insult, every condescending smirk, and every passive-aggressive jab. I did it because, foolishly, I still believed that Julian truly loved me. I kept waiting for him to keep the promises he had whispered to me in the dark, the vows that he would stand by my side and protect me from the venom of his relatives. I looked at him, desperately willing him to say something, anything, to defend his future wife. Instead, he just took a slow sip of his vintage wine, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate, pretending he had not heard a single word his mother and sister had just said. As the evening dragged on, the suffocating atmosphere in the room began to shift, twisting into something far more sinister. The polite chatter and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china seemed to fade into a low, buzzing drone in my ears. The lavish five-course meal felt like chewing on ash. I noticed Eleanor standing near the head table, no longer mingling with the senators or the banking heirs. She was repeatedly checking the diamond-encrusted watch on her left wrist, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the rim of her champagne flute. A slow, chilling, and triumphant smile began to stretch across her face. It was not the warm, welcoming smile of a mother hosting a rehearsal dinner for her beloved son. It was the calculated, predatory smile of an executioner waiting for the exact right second to drop the blade. She was waiting for a perfectly orchestrated moment, a trap carefully laid out in front of 80 powerful witnesses, designed specifically to corner me, humiliate her future daughter-in-law, and strip away whatever little dignity she thought I possessed. The final plates of gold leaf, adorned chocolate mousse had scarcely been whisked away by the fleet of silent waiters when a sharp, piercing sound cut through the low hum of conversation. Clink, clink, clink. The noise was abrupt and violently loud against the backdrop of soft string quartet music. It was not the gentle tap of a host preparing to offer a warm toast to the soon-to-be newlyweds. It was a commanding, authoritarian strike that demanded absolute obedience at the head of the main table. Eleanor stood up. The heavy fabric of her custom gown rustled aggressively as she rose to her full, imposing height. She did not offer a polite smile or a gracious nod to the crowd. Instead, she reached down beneath the edge of the long table and, with a swift, practiced motion, retrieved a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents. Before anyone could fully comprehend what was happening, Eleanor raised her arm and hurled the heavy file directly across the long expanse of the white silk tablecloth. The heavy folder became a dangerous projectile. It slid with terrifying speed, crashing violently into a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The delicate glass shattered instantly, sending a spray of pale golden liquid and sharp, jagged shards raining down over the immaculate floral centerpieces. The thick file skidded to a violent halt right at the edge of my dinner plate, the harsh black cover stark and ugly against the pristine white setting. "Sign it, gold digger," Eleanor commanded. Her voice was not a shout, but rather a chilling, razor-sharp hiss that somehow carried enough acoustic venom to bounce off the high vaulted ceilings. It was so impossibly clear and deliberate that the entire room froze in a state of absolute shock. 80 of the most powerful people on the eastern seaboard simultaneously snapped their mouths shut. The string quartet missed a note and abruptly stopped playing, letting the final chord die a painful death in the air. A horrifying, heavy silence descended upon the banquet hall, every single pair of judgmental, probing eyes in that room immediately swiveled away from their own hushed conversations and locked directly onto me, sitting frozen at the center of the wreckage. I could feel the intense, burning heat of their stares dissecting me, waiting for me to break down, cry, or run out of the room in disgrace. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sheer humiliation of being called such a vulgar name in front of senators, tech magnates, and shipping barons felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Instantly, I whipped my head to the side, my eyes locking onto Julian. I was waiting for the outrage. I was waiting for the man who had promised to love and cherish me to leap to his feet, shield me from the stares, and demand that his mother apologize for this unhinged, cruel spectacle. Instead, I witnessed the total, sickening collapse of the man I thought I was going to marry. Julian's entire body turned rigid, as if he had been struck by lightning and instantly turned to solid stone. He slouched his broad shoulders inward, bowing his head so low that his chin nearly rested on his chest. His eyes were glued with intense, desperate focus to a single silver fork resting beside his empty plate, acting as if the utensil was the most fascinating object in the universe. He did not utter a single syllable. He did not move a muscle to comfort me. He did not even dare to glance in my direction. He completely and utterly abandoned me to the wolves, shrinking away into his own pathetic cowardice, terrified of drawing his mother's wrath onto himself. The sheer force of his betrayal sent a rush of icy adrenaline straight into my veins, overriding any urge to panic, forcing my hands to remain absolutely steady so they would not give Eleanor the satisfaction of seeing me tremble. I reached out. My fingers brushed past the puddle of spilled champagne, ignoring the dampness seeping into the paper, and I flipped open the heavy black cover of the document. It was a prenuptial agreement, drafted with a level of cruelty and malice that quite literally took my breath away. I kept my face completely blank as I skimmed through pages of dense, suffocating legal jargon. The terms were not just strict, they were draconian, designed to strip a human being of their basic agency. Upon the event of a divorce, or even a temporary separation, I was to be entirely stripped of all marital property rights. There was a strict, multi-page clause permanently banning me from setting foot on any real estate owned by the Vance family across the globe, effective immediately upon the filing of any legal papers. Another section explicitly stated I would receive absolutely zero spousal support, zero alimony, and zero financial assistance of any kind, even if the marriage lasted for 50 years. They wanted to ensure that if I ever left Julian, I would leave with nothing but the clothes on my back, completely destitute and broken. But it was the final page that made a wave of genuine, bubbling shock rise in my throat, almost turning into a dark laugh. Buried at the very bottom, hidden under the guise of standard legal boilerplate, was a small, seemingly innocuous paragraph. It was an intellectual property transfer clause. The document explicitly demanded that upon signing this agreement, I must immediately and irrevocably surrender 100% of my personal shares, equity, and all intellectual property rights at Cipherloom Industries directly over to Julian Vance. The paperwork literally described this blatant extortion as a mandatory loyalty guarantee, to prove that my intentions entering the marriage were pure and untainted by financial greed. It was not enough for Eleanor to humiliate me in front of high society. She actually wanted to rob me blind. She honestly believed I was a naive, desperate little clerk who would blindly sign away my entire life's work just to keep my hands wrapped around her son's hollow, pathetic title. She thought she was cornering a helpless mouse, entirely unaware of the monster she had just invited into her home. I stared at the top of his perfectly styled hair. He did not flinch when the heavy folder slammed onto the table. His shoulders did not tense in surprise. He had braced himself well in advance. He knew exactly what was coming. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The man I had spent the last 2 years of my life with, the man who had held my hands and whispered countless promises of a shared future in the dark, had been entirely complicit in this cruel ambush. He had likely sat in his mother's private study, sipping expensive whiskey, nodding along like an obedient lapdog as she drafted a legal document designed to completely enslave me. The sharp, suffocating pain in my chest, the agonizing sting of a broken heart, suddenly vanished. It did not fade slowly. It evaporated in a fraction of a second, completely replaced by a freezing, hollow void. The grief of his betrayal was instantly burned away by a chilling, razor-sharp sense of absolute clarity. Directly across the table, a sudden, blinding flash of light caught my attention. Beatrice had brazenly lifted her smartphone, holding it high in the air, aiming the camera lens squarely at my face. The tiny red recording light blinked steadily, an electronic eye capturing my supposed downfall. She was not even trying to hide her malicious intent. Her lips were curled into a cruel, expectant smirk, her manicured thumb hovering over the screen. She was waiting for the grand finale of their show. She was waiting for the poor, pathetic commoner to finally crack under the immense pressure, to burst into ugly, humiliating tears, to violently push back her chair and flee the banquet hall in absolute disgrace. I knew exactly what she was planning to do with that footage. By midnight, that video would be circulating through dozens of private, highly exclusive group chats, providing endless entertainment for bored, vicious socialites who spent their days counting their trust funds and destroying reputations. They all expected a spectacular meltdown. They anticipated a fiery, hysterical display of wounded pride or a pathetic, blubbering plea for mercy. But human biology is a truly fascinating mechanism. Instead of my sympathetic nervous system triggering a frantic flight response, a strange, profound, and heavy stillness washed over my entire body. My racing heartbeat, which just seconds ago had been hammering violently against my ribs, abruptly slowed down to a steady, measured, and rhythmic thud. The ambient noise of the vast room, the hushed gasps of the 80 elite guests, the rustling of expensive fabrics, all melted away into total insignificance. The sharp, primal instincts of absolute survival and calculated predation flared to life within my mind. I was no longer a terrified victim trapped in a corner by a pack of wolves. I was a seasoned hunter calmly assessing her overly confident prey. Slowly, deliberately, I let a smile touch my lips. It was a faint, lifeless curve of the mouth, completely devoid of any warmth, joy, or even a single ounce of fear. It was the kind of smile that explicitly did not reach the eyes, a deeply unsettling, frozen expression that caused the smug grin on Beatrice's face to suddenly falter, and her phone to dip a fraction of an inch. I let my gaze sweep slowly across the long table, taking in the triumphant, arrogant faces of the Vance family one by one. I looked at Julian's stubbornly bowed head, at Beatrice's glowing screen, and finally, directly into Eleanor's cold, calculating eyes. Undeterred by my chilling lack of tears, Eleanor stepped closer, invading my personal space. She reached into her designer evening clutch and produced a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. With a theatrical, dismissive flick of her wrist, she sent the expensive pen rolling across the white silk tablecloth. It bumped gently against the edge of the black legal folder and stopped right in front of my folded hands. "Go on, darling," Eleanor urged, her voice dripping with mock sympathy and thick, suffocating condescension. "Sign it right now. This is your perfect opportunity to prove to all of us that your love for my son is entirely pure. Prove that you are not just another desperate parasite looking for a free ride on our legacy. If you truly do not care about material wealth, putting your signature on that dotted line should be the easiest task in the world." I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I rested my elbows gently on the edge of the table and began to tap my index finger rhythmically against the polished wood, hidden beneath the silk cloth. Tap, tap, tap. In the span of those few quiet seconds, my mind was running 1,000 complex calculations, tearing apart the structural architecture of their grand, pathetic scheme. I clearly saw the fatal, gaping hole in their supposedly impenetrable arrogance. The Vance family suffered from a lethal, blinding combination of unchecked greed and profound intellectual laziness. They were so utterly obsessed with extracting every last drop of potential value from me, so utterly desperate to claim legal ownership of my supposedly insignificant little shares, that their own overwhelming snobbery had completely blinded them, because I did not wear flashy designer labels, because I did not loudly brag about my investment portfolio at their lavish country club lunches. They simply assumed I was entirely beneath their notice. They had not bothered to run a single, basic financial background check. They had not spent even 5 short minutes investigating what Cypherloom Industries actually was, or who truly controlled it. They merely saw an obscure, provincial-sounding name, slapped a label of worthlessness onto it, and decided it was ripe for the taking. They were eagerly trying to rob a bank, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just handed the master vault keys directly to the owner. I did not pick up the solid gold fountain pen. Instead, I extended my index finger and gently nudged the ridiculously expensive writing instrument back across the white silk tablecloth. It rolled with a soft, heavy sound, coming to a dead stop, mere inches from Eleanor's meticulously manicured hand. I explicitly refused to even let my fingertips brush against the thick, oppressive stack of her prenuptial agreement. The sudden, undeniable rejection caused the triumphant, predatory smile on Eleanor's perfectly powdered face to freeze. A microscopic fracture appeared in her ironclad composure, a tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth that signaled the very first crack in her grand, impenetrable illusion of absolute control. Without breaking eye contact with the imposing matriarch, I reached down to my side. Resting against the leg of my chair was my handbag, the very same smooth plain leather tote that had been the subject of countless whispered jokes and scornful giggles among the women of this aristocratic circle, because it lacked a gaudy designer logo. I moved with agonizing slowness, unhurried and entirely at peace. I reached inside the soft leather interior and pulled out my own document. It was not a massive, intimidating binder meant to overwhelm and confuse. It was a single, impossibly thin, pitch-black folder, elegant and utterly lethal. I placed it onto the table, aligning it perfectly parallel to the sprawling, messy pile of the Vance family contract. "Before I sign away absolutely anything," I began, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence of the banquet hall. I did not yell. I did not let a single tremor of emotion bleed into my tone. My words rang out with the crisp, undeniable authority of a high court judge, delivering a final, unappealable sentence to a condemned prisoner. Before we discuss any transfers of assets or ridiculous guarantees of loyalty, I think it is only fair that we examine the actual financial transparency of this esteemed family. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I slid the thin black folder across the table directly toward Eleanor. The matriarch blinked, her forced smile now completely dissolving into a tight line of cautious irritation. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her heavily jeweled fingers hovering over the dark cover, before her sheer arrogance compelled her to flip it open. She expected a plea, a counteroffer, perhaps a pathetic list of demands from a desperate commoner trying to negotiate a small allowance. What she found instead was a certified, legally binding corporate verification record, stamped with the unmistakable, heavy seals of federal financial regulators. The first page did not contain a list of subservient compromises. It contained my name, printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, right above a title that made Eleanor's breath hitch audibly in her throat. The document legally and undeniably certified that I was not a lowly data entry clerk, grinding away for minimum wage. It stated, with absolute clarity, that I was the sole founder, the hidden chief executive officer, and the exclusive owner holding 100% of the private equity shares of Cypherloom Industries. I watched as Eleanor's eyes darted frantically across the page, reading the same lines over and over again, her brain violently rejecting the information her eyes were feeding it. As she stared in mute horror, the heavy, suffocating silence of the room was suddenly broken. It started as a low, rumbling murmur at the far end of the hall, where several veteran venture capitalists and aggressive hedge fund managers were seated. The name Cypherloom Industries had finally echoed long enough in their sharp, calculating minds to trigger a massive realization. The hushed whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd of elite guests, transforming rapidly into audible, shocked exclamations. The seasoned business titans in the room instantly recognized the name that the Vance family had so foolishly dismissed as a provincial, nobody startup. They knew exactly what Cypherloom Industries actually was. It was not a small tech support firm. It was the absolute titan of the biomedical materials technology sector, an ultra-secretive, rapidly expanding conglomerate that had aggressively acquired a massive series of major investment funds across the entire east coast of the United States just last month. The financial analysts in the room were already frantically whispering the company's estimated market valuation, tossing around figures in the multiple billions of dollars. The horrifying realization of their monumental miscalculation crashed down upon the head table. The woman they had spent the entire evening mocking for her unbranded dress and her supposedly impoverished background was, in reality, a completely self-made billionaire, wielding a level of liquid capital and industry dominance that made the Vance family's ancient, aristocratic wealth look like a child's piggy bank. Suddenly, a loud, scraping sound violently pierced the mounting chaos. Julian sprang up from his chair as if he had been physically burned by the silk upholstery. The heavy wooden chair toppled over behind him, crashing loudly against the marble floor, but he did not even turn to look at it. He stood paralyzed, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. Every single drop of blood had completely drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. His eyes, wide and dilated with sheer, unadulterated horror, darted frantically between my perfectly calm face and the open corporate document resting in front of his mother. In that brilliant, defining moment, the pathetic, agonizing truth shattered Julian's entire reality. He finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of what he had just done. The woman he had intended to leech off, the partner he had so arrogantly planned to manipulate, strip of her dignity, and legally bind into absolute submission, was not a helpless victim. He realized, with a suffocating wave of pure terror, that he had just tried to put a leash on an absolute leviathan, and in doing so, he had willingly handed over his own throat. The true, fatal strike, however, had not even been delivered yet, while the entire banquet hall was still reeling from the revelation of my identity. I calmly reached across the silk tablecloth. I placed my index finger on the corner of that heavy, certified corporate document resting in front of the paralyzed matriarch, with a slow, deliberate motion that drew every single eye in the room. I flipped to the second page. This was not another piece of my own corporate profile. It was a highly classified, heavily encrypted internal financial report belonging entirely to the Vance family. It was a document so deeply buried and guarded that it took my most elite team of forensic accountants weeks to extract it from the darkest corners of their offshore banking networks. "Since we are laying all of our cards on the table tonight," I said, my voice echoing with icy precision over the stunned crowd, "let us talk about the actual reason you were so desperate for me to sign away my life's work. Let us talk about the grand, untouchable Vance legacy." I tapped my perfectly manicured fingernail against the center of the page, right on top of a terrifyingly large number printed in glaring red ink. The horrifying, undeniable truth was suddenly laid bare under the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers. The majestic, historic Vance family, the supposed titans of industry who had spent the entire evening looking down their noses at my unbranded clothing, were completely and irreversibly bankrupt. They had been entirely insolvent for exactly 2 years. The catastrophic collapse had begun with a series of monumentally reckless commercial real estate investments made by Julian's late father. When those massive development projects completely imploded, they dragged the entire family fortune down into a suffocating abyss of toxic debt. The towering golden empire they paraded in front of high society was nothing more than a hollow, rotting shell, desperately painted over with lies and false prestige. "You have absolutely nothing left," I stated, locking my eyes directly onto Eleanor's trembling frame. "Your bank accounts are drained. Your shipping contracts were liquidated to pay off initial penalties. To maintain this pathetic, theatrical illusion of royalty, to afford these custom designer gowns and vintage champagne, you resorted to absolute desperation." I pointed to the third paragraph on the page. It detailed a massive, deeply toxic financial lifeline. Eleanor had secretly taken out a colossal, high-interest loan from an aggressive, predatory private investment fund based out of Manhattan. In order to secure that desperate cash injection, she had legally mortgaged absolutely everything. She had signed away the remaining equity of their holding company, their private jets, and most damning of all, she had put up the very ground beneath our feet as collateral. The Sapphire Point Manor, the crown jewel of the Vance legacy, was entirely leveraged to a shadow lender. Then came the twist that finally sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the massive banquet hall. You thought you were so incredibly clever. Eleanor, I continued, my tone dropping into a lethal, quiet register that forced the 80 powerful guests to lean in and hold their breath. You took out that massive loan with a balloon payment you knew you could never, ever afford. But then, you found out your spineless son was dating a woman who owned a tech startup. You did not bother to research Cypherloom Industries because your arrogance convinced you it was just some pathetic, small-time operation. You drafted this monstrous prenuptial agreement not to protect your non-existent wealth from a gold digger. You drafted it as a desperate, predatory trap. Your grand master plan was to force me to surrender my company to Julian tonight, so you could immediately liquidate it tomorrow morning, sell off my assets, and use the cash to pay down your catastrophic debt. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to deny it, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. But here is the single, catastrophic flaw in your little scheme, I whispered, delivering the final, crushing blow. That predatory private investment fund you borrowed from, the one holding the mortgage to your company, your trust funds, and this very mansion? Cypherloom Industries initiated a hostile takeover of that exact fund and absorbed all of its assets exactly 3 months ago. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The math was brutally, beautifully simple. By acquiring that fund, I had absorbed all of its outstanding accounts. I am not just the woman you tried to humiliate tonight, I declared, my voice ringing with total, unassailable dominance. I am your absolute, legal creditor. I own your debts. I own your company. And as of this exact moment, I own the very roof over your head. I hold the entire, pathetic lifeline of the Vance dynasty right in the palm of my hand. The sheer, monumental weight of the truth finally crushed the matriarch. Eleanor's face turned the color of wet ash. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, staggering backward violently. Her high heels tangled in the heavy fabric of her expensive gown, and she heavily slumped against the edge of the dining table, wrapping both of her trembling arms around her chest as she began to hyperventilate, looking as though her heart was actively giving out. Off to the side, the cruel, mocking smirk had been violently wiped from Beatrice's face. Her eyes were completely glazed over in shock, her mouth hanging wide open in silent terror. Her fingers went completely numb, and the expensive smartphone she had been using to boldly live stream my intended humiliation slipped right out of her grasp. The device fell through the air and hit the solid marble floor with a loud, sharp crack, the screen violently shattering into 1,000 useless pieces, echoing the absolute, irreversible destruction of her family's entire world. The absolute silence that had gripped the banquet hall suddenly shattered, replaced by a deafening, chaotic explosion of frantic whispers and sharp gasps. The 80 elite guests, the very people Eleanor had invited to witness my grand humiliation, were now actively turning their backs on her. I watched with immense satisfaction as senators, hedge fund managers, and real estate tycoons physically leaned away from the main table, their faces twisted in disgust and overwhelming contempt. In high society, poverty is the only true crime, and the Vance family had just been exposed as the most pathetic frauds in the entire room. The grand but historical dynasty was instantly reduced to a humiliating punchline, a fake empire collapsing under the unbearable weight of its own arrogance. Suddenly, the spell of sheer terror that had paralyzed Julian finally broke. He scrambled around the edge of the table, tripping over his own expensive leather shoes, and threw himself toward me. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and desperately grabbed onto my wrists. Tears were actively streaming down his handsome face, entirely ruining his perfectly composed, aristocratic facade. "Lucia, please," Julian sobbed, his voice cracking loudly in front of the entire assembly. "You have to believe me. I had absolutely no idea she was planning any of this. I did not know how cruel she could be, or how bad the finances were. She hid everything from me. Please, do not do this to us. I love you." It was the ultimate display of spinelessness. Even now, facing total annihilation, He was instinctively cowering behind his mother, desperately trying to throw her under the bus to save his own skin. I looked down at his panicked, tear-stained face, feeling nothing but profound, freezing disgust. With a sharp, violent motion, I forcefully yanked my hands out of his grip, stepping back to ensure there was clear space between us. "You did not know?" I asked, my voice laced with absolute, razor-sharp disdain. "Or did you just choose to close your eyes and play along because you thought I was a naive, easy target to manipulate? You thought you could trade my dignity for a few more months of pretending to be rich. Your cowardice is significantly cheaper and far more pathetic than this invisible, rotting inheritance of yours." Julian recoiled, as if I had physically struck him, covering his face with his trembling hands. I did not waste another second looking at him. I reached into my bag one final time and pulled out my own pen. It was not a solid gold, diamond-encrusted prop meant to show off fake wealth. It was a sleek, reliable, matte black instrument. I completely ignored the massive, ridiculous prenuptial agreement still sitting on the silk tablecloth. Instead, I opened my thin black folder to the very last page. Resting there was a formal, legally binding foreclosure notice, meticulously prepared by my elite corporate legal team days in advance. I pressed the nib of my pen against the thick paper and signed my name with bold, sweeping strokes, officially executing the total seizure of their remaining assets. I picked up the freshly signed document and tossed it dismissively onto the table. It fluttered in the air for a brief second before landing directly on top of Eleanor's absurd prenuptial contract. "You have exactly 30 days to pack your personal belongings and vacate my mansion," I declared, my voice carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "And you can go ahead and completely cancel the wedding. I have absolutely no interest in doing charity work for a family of bankrupt parasites." I did not wait for a response. I did not need to see Eleanor weeping over the paperwork or Beatrice staring blankly at her shattered phone. I simply turned my back on the wreckage of their dynasty. I walked proudly down the center aisle of the banquet hall, my head held high. Not a single person dared to block my path. The wealthy guests practically parted like the sea, watching me with a mixture of profound shock and newfound, terrifying respect. I pushed open the massive, heavy oak doors of the grand entrance and stepped out into the cool, dark night. The harsh, suffocating smell of imported orchids and fake prestige was instantly replaced by the crisp, refreshing, and incredibly pure scent of the ocean breeze. I took a deep, liberating breath, listening to the crashing waves in the distance. I was leaving behind a family that was currently drowning in the absolute depths of their own ultimate humiliation, decisively ending a dangerous game of power that they had foolishly started with the wrong woman. Thank you so much for listening to the very end of this story. My wonderful audience, I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, since our channel has unfortunately lost its ability to monetize, and we currently lack the budget to continue operations, we will definitely not be uploading any new videos here on YouTube in the upcoming future. We are entirely transitioning our efforts to Patreon. If you found today's story empowering and entertaining, please help us keep the channel alive by joining our Patreon family of Maya Revenge Stories. Over there, you will get to listen to the absolute best, longest, and most detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code visible on your screen, or by using the direct link provided in the description box and the pinned comment. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart, and I cannot wait to share the next thrilling revenge story with you on our new platform.